Good afternoon to everyone. My name is Giulia Andrighetto. This is a joint work with many co-authors, as you can see, and one of them is here, right in the back, Ancho Sanchez. So we are happy to present this work today. That data have been recently collected, so we are eager to also listen to comments and possible suggestions. And the work is aimed to test the effect of risk in shaping the emergence and change of social norms, and we do that in the context of a long-term experiment with the collective risk dilemma. So as it has been argued over the last 2 days, social norms play a key role in our social life. From the more prosaic interactions, like the way in which we greet each other, by shaking hands, by saying hello, by kissing 1, 2, 3 times, starting from the right or from the left. They also regulate the way in which we talk each other, and the fact that we leave tips in restaurants, even when we are not formally required to do that. And also the amount to tip, 10, 15, 20%. But social norms have also been argued to be key mechanisms for solving some very important societal challenges of our times, like climate change, for example, habitat destruction, but also decline in vaccinations. Why? Because they all represent social dilemma situations, situations in which the group is better off if everyone contributes, but there is an individual cost. So individuals prefer not to do that. And social norms have been argued to be a solution for this dilemma, for these dilemmas, because they push people to behave in a way that is against their self-interest. So social norms have been referred to as the glue of society, the grammar of society, the cement of it. However, the empirical foundation is still limited. So much of the experimental work is assessing the existence of norms through the observed behavior. So typically experiments, they start with assumptions from the, for example, rational choice model, and if the behavior deviates from this assumption, so people cooperate or people punish, they assume that is due to social preferences or is due to social norms. We think that this is a fundamental gap, that of not having a clear way of measuring norms, and even more importantly, to assess the causal effect of social norms on behavior, whether there are really social norms that are causing the behavior or not. And we would like to start contributing filling this gap. So in order to be able to measure social norms and to assess the causal impact of them on the behavior, it's necessary to define what social norms are. There are many definitions of norms. The one that we are adopting here is the one provided by Cristina Bicchieri. So norms are shared behavioral rules that prescribe what individuals ought or are not to do, followed because of expectations and potentially sanctions. So individuals comply with norms because of expectations. Expectations are social expectations and can be of 2 different types. Empirical expectations that are beliefs about what others do. So they describe the social world, and there are also normative expectations, are beliefs about what others expect us to do. And they provide the normative aspect of norms. And the social norm then has 2 components, a behavioral component and a belief component. And the 2 of them are crucial and necessary for a norm to exist. Once we have such a definition of norm, that is an operational definition of norm, it's also possible to test the causal impact of norms, because you can manipulate expectations and see whether by manipulating them there is a change in the behavior. So what do we do? Based on the definition of social norms that I've just described, that consists of both behavior and beliefs, we want to measure their emergence and change due to risk over time. And we do this in the framework of a collective risk dilemma. It has been used to model different strategic interactions, for example, climate change by Milinski. And what we do, as I will describe, we vary the risk, and we measure subjects' behavior, expectations, and punishment to capture whether norms have emerged in that context, and also whether the risk allow them to change. And then we manipulate the expectation to see whether those norms have a causal effect on the behavior. So we have conducted a 30-day experiment. So we decided to move from the lab to the field. Our subjects could play their experiment through their mobile phones. And we decided to have a long-term experiment because of the type of research question. We thought that for analyzing, for understanding the emergence and change of social norms, a time lapse of 60, 90 minutes was not enough. That's why we decided to have 30 days, a 30-day experiment. And subjects were allowed to decide in situ, so they don't have to go into the lab. And we also, there was also another advantage that we could have access to a broader and more diverse population, because not only those subjects that were able to come to the lab at a specific time were tested, but also a much broader subject pool. And we code it by using O3, and we use the Ibsen platform, that is a platform that has been developed by Ancho Sanchez and colleagues as an output of a European project. And it has 30,000 subjects, so a huge amount of subjects. The collective risk dilemma. So we had groups of 6 subjects that receive an endowment of 100 tokens. And they were asked to contribute from 0 to, they had the possibility to contribute from 0 to 100 of their tokens to a public good. And they knew that a certain threshold should be reached. And the threshold was a threshold of 300 tokens. If the threshold, if the threshold is not reached, with a certain probability, a catastrophe would occur. And all the subjects will lose all their endowments. So the payoffs are the following. If the threshold is reached, then each subject keep his own endowment minus what he or she put in the public good. If the threshold is not exceeded, they lose everything with a certain probability, or otherwise they keep the endowment minus what they contributed with a certain probability. And the equilibrium here is dependent on the risk. If the risk is 0.5, is below 0.5, then the equilibrium is that of contributing 0. If it's 0.5 or above 0.5, there are multiple equilibria, that of contributing 0, but also that of contributing at the threshold level.
So what are the experimental conditions?
I will describe you the conditions in a second. Here we are, just a second. So we had 6 subjects and groups were rematched every day. This is just for making our life more difficult. So every day groups were rematched. Treatments. So research question is, can the risk of a disaster shape norm emergence and change? We had a within and between subject design. The within subject design consisted in having 14 rounds with a certain probability of the disaster to occur, that is 0.9. And then after 14 rounds, we changed the probability of the disaster to occur to 0.6. The between treatment design is that of reverting the order. So here we start with a high risk and move to a low risk. Here we start with a low risk and we move to a high risk. We had 148 subjects in our first treatment and 138 subjects in our second treatment. Hypothesis. So our first hypothesis is that empirical and normative expectations are related to contribution. Our second hypothesis is that empirical and normative expectation causally affect contribution. Then we also have an hypothesis about punishment, that punishment is targeted at non-contributors, and people can also anticipate that. And our last hypothesis is that it takes longer for cooperation to break down than it does for cooperation to emerge, because behavior supported by social norms is more resilient than behavior in conflict with social norms. Let me tell you something more about our design. So, as I said before, every day our subjects had to take a decision. So, and they have to decide how much they want to contribute. every day, either before or after the decision, we also ask them about their personal normative beliefs. So we ask them, in your opinion, how much should each person in your group contribute? And they can put a number between 0 and 100. Then also every day, either before or after their decision, we also ask questions about their empirical expectations. They have to, for each of the other 5 subjects in the group, they have to ask the following question: how much you think that the other people in your group contribute? And the more accurate the guess, the higher they will be paid, so it's incentivized. The same kind of question for normative expectations: how much the other people in your group think that you should each contribute. Again, is incentivized. And this was done, these 3 questions, every day. Then, the first day and the last day of the treatment, and a couple of times in between, we also ask hypothetical questions. So, and we ask them, how much will you contribute if most of the other people in your group contribute at least 50 points and think that you should each contribute at least 50 points? This was a way for us to manipulate empirical and normative expectations. We had combinations in which both were high, both were low, or one was high and one was low. This is a way of testing the causal effect of them. At the very end of the experiment, we also had a task in which we asked subjects to punish another subjects. They were randomly matched, and we asked them, how much would you punish someone that contributed less than 50 points, and more than 50 points, and also expectations about others on punishment. We provided them with feedback. So they had a list after each decision. After each round, they could see the following screen. So they could see how much each of the other subjects in their group contributed. They could see if the threshold was reached or not. They could see whether the catastrophe occurred or not, and also their remaining earnings. At the very first day of the experiment, we also asked them to go through a bunch of psychological tests in order to collect not just information, let's say social information, but also information about their psychological traits. It's very important for us also to have information about risk preferences, given the nature of the game. And everything was pre-registered. So we pre-registered the design, the hypothesis, and the analysis before running the experiment. Results. Let me start with the contribution levels. So we find that when the risk is high, the level of contribution is significantly higher than when the risk is low. This was expected. We don't find, in terms of average contribution level, any effect of the order. So if the high risk is before, or if the high risk comes after the low risk, we don't find any significant effect. But if we look at the number, the proportion of groups reaching the threshold, and this is really what is interesting for us, because if they don't get the threshold, they lose everything. We can observe that the ordering matters. So in the high-risk treatment first, a certain amount of groups are able to reach the threshold, and a significantly lower amount of groups is able to reach the threshold if the high condition comes after. So in terms of contribution level, no difference. There is a big difference, a significant difference in terms of groups able to reach the threshold. Okay, this is the behavior that we observe. Let's have a look at the mechanisms. So our first hypothesis was that cooperation is related to the empirical and normative expectations. Here are results from 3 models in which we test the effect of empirical and normative expectations on the levels of contribution. And we can find then in all 3 models, from the most simple one to the more complex one, in which we also included a bunch of psychological measures and demographic informations, the effect of empirical and normative expectation is always positive, and is significant. So empirical and normative expectations have both an effect on the contribution levels. But now we have information about the behavior, we have information about the expectations, there is an association between the two. It's really because of norms that subjects behave in this way or because of something else. So here there is information about the hypothetical situations. So here what I show is the absolute increase in cooperation of these three combinations of expectations when they are both high, when the empirical are high and the normative are low, when the empirical are low and the normative are high, relative to the low condition, when they both are low, the low empirical and low normative. And we can observe that in all three conditions, there is a positive effect of empirical and normative expectations on the behavior. So let's start from here. When the empirical are high and the normative are low, there is an increase in contribution. Even more interesting that when the empirical are low and the normative are high, the increase is even higher. And this should not occur because this is a belief about something that doesn't have any economic importance for them. And of course, this is expected when both of them are high. This is the highest increase in cooperation. Let's move to the punishment behavior. As expected, we find that when subjects contribute less than 50 is when they are punished the most. And also, people expect that. That is also support for our third hypothesis. Last result. So our fourth hypothesis is that it takes longer for cooperation to break down once it is established than for cooperation to emerge. If we look at the low-risk condition where cooperation has not been established, we can see that the jump from the low to high-risk condition is higher than the jump from the high to the low condition. And this is significant. It means that there is a difference in the change when we move from the norm to be established from a situation in which, and then we change the risk and the other way around. And what I said before is that even if we don't find a difference in terms of average contribution, we found a difference in the percentage of groups that was able to reach the threshold. Let me now move to the, my last slide. Why is that? So why we find that it takes longer for cooperation to break down than for cooperation to emerge? We had a look at the consensus. What do we mean with consensus? With consensus is the convergence between personal normative beliefs, empirical expectation, normative expectation, and the behavior. This is the way in which we have now modeled the consensus. We are very happy also to listen for some suggestions to model in a different way. This was the way in which we have done so far. And we can observe that there is a higher consensus in the high risk context than in the low risk context. This seems to show that when the risk is high, also stronger and tighter norms are present. And this could be an explanation why, when the risk, when norms have been established, it's much more difficult to change the behavior than when social norms have not been established, because they make the change slower. And that's all. So we have tested the effect of risk, not just on the behavior, but also on the emergence of social norms. We have also observed that stronger norms emerge in risky environments, and that social norms are able to sustain the behavior and make it more resistant to change. And thanks a lot. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. It was very fascinating. I was wondering, maybe I missed that, but where did you conduct this experiment?
Where?
Where, yeah.
Online, so
were there different people, like from different cultures and different countries?
All from Spain.
Okay.
And they
You
were
have any demographic knowledge about
yes,
them?
Yes. So half of them were students,
Okay.
and then half of them, so there was a good balancing between male and females, and also with those that were experienced with experiments or not. So we tried also to,
Okay.
of course, control for all these features.
Yeah, so I think that it might be interesting to like think about the religious differentiations between people, and if there are like some sort of subcultural groups within Spain, like to test the changes between those cultures. And just a quick second question, and how do you explain the fact that when the normative expectation, that there's a bigger difference when the normative expectations are high and the empirical expectations are low than the other way around? What is your conjecture on that?
So that injunctive norms seem to play a bigger role in influencing behavior than descriptive norms. So when people know that others are behaving in a certain way, this is the descriptive norm, this has an effect, but it has an even stronger effect when they know that others want them to behave in a certain way. So the normativity matters and seems in our case to matter more than the mere behavioral regularity.
I have a question regarding, I'm not sure I understand, are you treating every day as a new day, or are you allowing for learning to some extent? And what kind of feedback does everyone receive after?
So every day they receive this feedback. So they receive information about the amount of contribution of all the other 5 subjects in their group, but they will change group because every day they play in a different group. So they cannot learn how to behave and how to play. They can, yes, because we wanted to see how a norm can emerge not in small groups, but in the broader population.
Maybe just to follow up on that a little, I wasn't sure from the data, but how important is it that a disaster actually happens at some point? So once a disaster happens and we lose all our money, does that tighten the norms afterwards, or does that change contribution behavior?
That's a good question. We didn't, so I don't know because I would need to test.
I just wonder, thinking about this in the context of climate change.
Yeah.
We know there's a disaster, but it's way in the future, it may never happen. Would it really help if it was a big disaster that concentrate the mind?
So
You can look at that.
when a disaster occurs, they lose everything, right? But I don't know what's the effect in the next round for them because they are not grouped together again. They change. So I can have an information at the individual level. What happens in the strategy of someone that just suffered a catastrophe, right?
So I was curious, we found something pretty similar in an evolutionary game theory model where we looked at punishment as a stage 1 and then, cooperation and then punishment,
Yes.
using all of Arnie's crazy strategies. And we also found that and we were looking at how threat affects the evolution of cooperation and punishment. And we also found that when you decrease threat suddenly, it takes a really long time for cooperation to change.
Yes.
Just like you found. And I'm just wondering what in your data might explain that, because we can never quite explain why that was the case, why this is asymmetry, that going from not very threatened to threatened really makes cooperation happen very quickly and responsible punishment very quickly. But it was much more cultural inertia going from
My
threat to
explanation
no
would
threat.
be the following. So if we go from high to low, in the high context, there is much more consensus about the norm than if we move from the low to the high. So it's the norm that seems to sustain, is persisting. Yeah. So once the norm is there, it's much more difficult for a change to occur. So even if you change the incentive, in this case we are changing an incentive, right? But for the behavior, it takes longer to change than if the norm has not been set yet. Maybe it's more risky, yes, to change, yes.
Thanks so much for a great session.
Thank you.